You think your pain and heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read. It was Dostoevsky and Dickens who taught me that the things that tormented me most were the very things that connected me with all of the people who were alive or who had ever been alive. That's James Baldwin talking about reading, and that feeling of being not just understood, but connected to almost everyone else in history is one of the best reasons to pick up a fiction book and dive into another world. But there are a lot of underrated reasons to read fiction, and so if you've always been kind of a non-fiction person, or maybe you used to read a bit more fiction but you're trying to get back into it, I'm going to try and give you at least 4 reasons to do it in this video. All the books that I mention or show on screen are going to be linked in the description, so let's just get straight on with the Better World Effect. So in the late Qing dynasty, a politician and social activist named Liang Qichao translated several books by Jules Verne and H.G. Wells into classical Chinese while he was also studying medicine. Then during the Cultural Revolution, science fiction basically disappeared in mainland China. But then in the 1990s it started to make a comeback, and now Chinese authors are writing some of the most interesting and well-regarded science fiction currently being produced. So what changed? Well, according to one version of the story, the CCP sent delegations abroad to find out what the people at Microsoft, Google and Apple were doing that their own engineers and scientists weren't. And they found that almost all of them had read science fiction when they were young. And so the point here is that fiction can show you a different world and give you ideas for how to make it better. So Nikola Tesla, for instance, was a huge fan of Goethe, and it was supposedly while reciting one of his verses that he had the idea that would lead to the rotating magnetic field and ultimately to alternating current. And Tesla wasn't alone. Mark Zuckerberg, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk have all been open about how much of an influence speculative science fiction had on them in their youth, and we're continuing to see innovations that were foreshadowed in works by people like Neal Stephenson. But even if you're not planning on reshaping people's lives with technology, fiction lets us see that the world doesn't have to be the way it is. Fiction can remind us that society could be very different or more fair, and that one person can make huge change in the world even when things seem bleak. And that's also an example of the next point that we're going to talk about, which is the viewquake. So a viewquake is economist Robin Hanson's word for insights that dramatically change one's worldview, making one see the world in a new way. And these most obviously come from non-fiction, so for instance a lot of people report having something like a viewquake when they first read Stoic philosophy or about the law of compounding returns. But in fiction, viewquakes don't happen in quite the same way. So for instance, I think that one way viewquakes come from fiction is by putting you in the shoes of a character who's experiencing things that you've only ever been told about in the abstract before. So you can read about what it was like to live under Stalinist repression, but one day in the life of Ivan Denisovich brings that to life in a way that non-fiction books often can't. Or you can understand on an intellectual level how the difference in strength between men and women makes life very different for the two sexes. But reading Naomi Alderman's The Power brings that home in a way that just looking at like charts and tables can't. But there's another way that reading fiction can bring abstract ideas to life, and for that we need to talk about the Austen factor. So when I was younger, my mum was always trying to get me to read Jane Austen, like telling me how funny and insightful it was, and how it was this brilliant depiction of social relationships that still felt relevant today. And I was like, yeah, I'll pass on that, thanks. It doesn't even have any action scenes in it. And then in my 20s, I realised that I was terrible at talking to people. And so I read a whole load of the usual self-help books, like How to Make Friends and Influence People, and Leah Loud's How to Talk to Anyone, to fix it. And then recently I read Emma and Pride and Prejudice pretty much back to back, and I was like, oh yeah, this would have actually helped me out in my 20s. Because fiction lets you get inside the heads of its characters in a way that really no other medium can. And because you're sort of forced to sit with them for a long time, you get a lot of chances to think about their motivations and the way they relate to other people. And so for instance, when you read Emma, you sort of realise that the way Emma treats Miss Bates comes from this like real emotional immaturity on her part, and this kind of need to fit in and seem smart and funny, even if it comes at the expense of someone else. And you might even recognise that behaviour in yourself and realise that it's having the opposite of the effect that you're hoping for. Because even though our lives have changed immensely in the last 500 years or so, our brains and our basic motivations haven't. And so reading Chaucer or Shakespeare or Charlotte Bronte can give you this incredible insight into what makes people tick that you don't really get from other places. So I think that fiction can make you a more empathetic person, but I also think it just makes you into a person who's able to navigate social situations and understand other people better. And in combination with everything else we've already talked about, I think that can help you to navigate the world and your own relationships more successfully. But there's one last reason to read more fiction, and I think maybe it's the most underrated one of all, and that is, it's just fun. Because the thing is, not everything has to be for something. I think when you read non-fiction, there's often a sense that there must be some greater purpose to it. Like you're trying to just distill the most important lessons from it, and maybe you could get them from like a book summary or speed reading. But fiction is a way to get away from all that. It's about slowing down and going somewhere else for a while. It's a way to live 100 lives inside of this one that we actually get. It's a way to take the experiences and ideas and ways of phrasing things that somebody might have thought out for years or even decades and condensing them down into just a few hundred pages. There's an absolute world of insight and knowledge out there, and the greatest authors in history are more available than they've ever been. All you need to do is pick a book up. And if that feels difficult, maybe that's not surprising, because the way the world is built these days is to offer you almost endless distractions. But if you want a better way to build a daily reading habit and read some of these great works, then I've got a video about that right here. Thanks for watching.